Chapter 3, page 35 through 38. It would be better to put the dog out of his misery before he left, and he thought of the dog lying helpless and injured, trapped for 3 days in the cage. At least he should die outside, free once more. Andy smashed the padlock with his belt axe and opened the cage door. He reached inside, carefully turned the dog, and slid him out head first. Then he lifted the rifle, placed the muzzle against the dog's forehead, and drew back the bolt. He was about to pull the trigger when the dog's eyes opened and looked at the boy. The blue eyes of the boy and the yellow ones of the dog studied each other. His eyes held the boy's with as direct a gaze as Andy had ever known. Scarcely realizing what he was doing, Andy tilted the rifle muzzle away and eased back the bolt. As though that was what he had waited for, the dog's eyes closed. Andy watched for them to open again. Then he realized they weren't going to. He knelt there, trying to decide what to do. Until a moment ago, the solution had been simple. Then he had looked into those yellow eyes and was no longer sure. Maybe the dog had a chance to live. If he did, he deserved it after all he'd been through. Andy decided he'd have to take the dog home with him. That would be a real job with some 5 miles of deep, soft snow to plow through. He'd need some sort of sled to put the dog on. Andy studied the cold sky, gauging the light he had left, about an hour. It would be very late when he got home. He'd better face the prospect that he might become too tired and have to spend the night out. In sub-zero weather, that was a thing no one deliberately did. He'd never done it, but he was sure he could. He had plenty of matches and his rifle. Maybe the dog will die on the way home anyway, he thought. If he does, I'll just leave him. His mind made up, Andy's thoughts turned to something he could haul the dog on. He didn't want to, but he returned to the plane and began searching through the wreckage. He found a 4-foot wingtip that had been torn away. It was light and would make a great sled. Now he needed straps or rope to make a harness for himself and to tie the dog on. There might be some inside the plane. Andy wrenched the door open and crawled inside. He made his way to the back carefully, keeping his eyes from the still figure in the seat. There, he found a coil of rope. Andy cut holes through the tin aluminum wing and threaded the rope through. He made a loop big enough to slip over his shoulders and across his chest. He pulled this makeshift sled to the iron cage. The dog opened his eyes briefly as Andy carefully worked the animal's body onto the sled and tied it with ropes across the shoulders and hips. With the dog secured, Andy took up his rifle. He worked the rope across his shoulders and chest, leaned into the rope, and began the long, slow miles home. At the end of the first quarter mile, Andy knew he had tackled a bigger job than he'd thought. The snow was deep, and though the wing section slid easily enough, the dog was heavy. The pale sun fell behind the ridges, and night spread swiftly across the land. The moon came up, and the stars were bright, casting an eerie, soft light over the snow, in which the boy could see a surprising distance. Andy continued his slow pace back down the valley, stopping to rest only when he could go no further. At each stop he went back, knelt beside the dog, and stroked his head and spoke to him. Several times the dog opened his yellow eyes briefly. Andy's stops became longer and oftener. After several hours, he realized he hadn't the strength to get home. He'd better look for a place to spend the night before he was too tired to get a fire going and drag up enough wood for the long hours ahead. He found a spot some minutes later against a downed tree. At the big end of the tree, he kicked the snow away to make a hollow to start a fire. He gathered dead limbs in the nearby brush and dragged them up. With his belt axe, he had chopped an armload of sliver from the side of a tree. Luckily, he had cut into a pocket of pitch. The pitch flamed up with the first match, and he carefully added chips. He broke the limbs and fed them into the flames until the fire was big and roaring. Then he pulled the broken wing with the dog close to the log. The heat hit the log and bounced back. It made a small pocket of warmth in the freezing cold of the night. Andy loosed the ropes and felt the dog's nose. It was hot and dry. He guessed that the dog had a fever and hadn't had a drink for several hours. Andy packed his handkerchief with snow and held it close to the heat and let the melting snow soak the handkerchief. He lifted the dog's head, pried his jaws apart, and squeezed the precious drops into his mouth. The dog could not swallow, and Andy stroked his throat. At last, he felt the muscles work once, convulsively. He repeated the procedure several times, and each time he had to stroke the animal's throat. Andy gathered more wood and built the fire high. He sat with his back against the downed tree and let the heat soak in. He watched the dog closely, hoping the heat would arouse him, but there was no change. Andy wondered if his folks were worrying, and guessed they were. He wasn't too worried or disturbed. He had his rifle, the fire was big and warm, and there was plenty of wood. The presence of the dog, even in his present condition, wiped out all feeling of loneliness. Some time later, he heard the wolf pack running through the barren ridges high above. Their voices came down into the valley in a series of high, savage notes that echoed and re-echoed up and down the valley. Their sounds seemed to get to the dog, or Andy imagined that he moved slightly. The boy tossed more wood on the fire, and the flames leaped up, spreading their light across the snow. He laid his rifle across his knees and leaned over to stroke the dog's head. He said gently, "It's all right. It's all right." But he couldn't tell if the dog heard him or not.